Hello everyone. This is again Enamul Haque from Bangladesh and my friend Philip Shah from Canada. Last month we talked about trust and the trust that is going down around the world from each other and the problem that we had. But this month we're going to talk about the North Arctic Ocean, particularly the Greenland issue. We all know about the Trump's move in order to in order to include Greenland as a part of the United States. That's what they wanted. There has been protest all over, protest from Europe, probably protest from Canada, I believe, and there has been discussion within Greenland also. They have been also against it. I'm not sure whether 100% of the population in Greenland is only 57,000 people. It's a huge landmass, but only 57,000 people. Economically, they're totally, according to my understanding, dependent on Denmark. They are subsidizing this island as a part of a independent, not an independent state, but as a territory of Greenland, of Denmark, I believe. And I was listening to it, and we are now, if you think around the world, everyone is looking at this, how Trump is going to deal with it. Having said it, we all know that United States already had armed battalion inside Greenland as a part of their probably NATO. I'm not sure whether it's a part of NATO or whether it's part of Second World War occupation. Whatever is the reason, they have it. There are the whole world is watching carefully. I'm not sure whether the whole world sees everything in the same way, but at least on Greenland, Europe and Canada is very strong. Not only that, it has led the European to change their strategy towards the east. In other words, we now know that they are all looking at developing relationship with the second largest economy in the world, China. Right now, as we speak, I think British Prime Minister is in China and talking about the trade relationship with the Chinese. So, I think we, given this, I think we would like to hear from Phil because Greenland is almost stone's throw away from Canadian border, and with the Arctic Ocean becoming a navigable. In other words, this is what we are now thinking about it with the global warming, with the climate change. The Russian has already opened up the Arctic Ocean for 4 months in a year. That's what they are thinking of. And I'm sure Canadian also have a passage that will also reduce the distance between Asia and North America. So, given all this, let me hear from Phil how this northern, Arctic Ocean is dealt with. How what is the story of the Canadian Prime Minister? We all know Canadian Prime Minister is very sharp. He has been in Davos, and his speech was well acclaimed around the world.
Well,
Phil?
thank you very much, Enamul, and it's a pleasure to be back here this week or this month for another edition of East West. But when it comes to the Arctic, that's very close to my heart because Canadian students grew up believing that the Arctic was mostly Canadian, because we have a vast Arctic territory north of the 60-degree latitude that is all part of Canada. And in fact, we have a military base at way up near the 80th latitude on the northern portion of Ellesmere Island, which is the most northern part of Canada, up in the Arctic archipelago. Not only that, but Ellesmere Island, Canada, is at its closest point about 27 kilometers away from Greenland. So you could imagine when the world was fixated on Greenland over the last 3 weeks, with the American administration being very aggressive with regard to Greenland and President Trump saying we're going to acquire Greenland, that, during that discussion, whether it was from the Americans or whether it was from the Europeans defending themselves, you never heard much about Canada in that discussion.
No.
The bottom line is between Greenland and Alaska, well, that's all of Canada up there in the Arctic, and it made for a lot of nervous times here in Canada, and basically they continue. For instance, Dr. Haque talked to me earlier about the Northwest Passage, which is a waterway that goes through the Arctic waters over the top of Canada. out the other side, whether it's in toward Greenland or whether it's toward Alaska and then down through the Bering Strait with global warming, there's thoughts that these waterways are going to open up. Now, it is true that throughout Canadian history, we've always claimed that territory. And throughout our history, we have put military bases there and government agencies, and we've always spent a lot of money on our defense with flights going up in the Arctic to as partly a claim of sovereignty to that territory. Because keep in mind, if you're listening to this podcast in Bangladesh or Southeast Asia or Africa or some type of tropical country where it's warm all the time, we're talking about a very harsh climate up in the Arctic where, minus 50 degrees Celsius is very common in winter, almost 24 hours of darkness. And a large part of the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic up in the archipelago, is uninhabited. And keep in mind how harsh of a climate there is. There are indigenous people, and the indigenous people are related in Canada to the indigenous Greenlanders who are in Greenland. And it's always been part of the Canadian dream, the Canadian imagination, and part of who we are as a people. For instance, I was thinking, Dr. Haque and I got to know each other in a place called Guelph, Ontario, which is in southern Ontario, relatively southern part of the country. And I was just wondering how far Enamul got north in Canada while he lived here, because for instance, myself, about the farthest north I've been in Canada is Edmonton, Alberta. But while I was in Edmonton, Alberta, I was in the airport there, and plane after plane after plane was taking off, and they said Canadian North, and they had polar bears as emblems on them. And these planes were taking off for the north, and they were taking off for places up in the Arctic like Grise Fiord and Iqaluit, places way up in the Arctic archipelago where very, very few live, and the conditions are very, very harsh. However, there is natural resources up in the Arctic, whether it's in the Canadian Arctic or whether it's in the Greenland Arctic or whether it's the Arctic in general, whether it's above Russia or Norway or Finland or countries such as that. And as global warming advances and as the planet gets warmer, these waters are becoming a lot more navigable. And so, the President Trump has said, of course, he needs Greenland to defend against China and Russia and other interests taking over those waters. Now, the Greenlanders have said that we haven't seen a Russian ship or a Chinese ship in these waters at all, but you know what I mean. I mean, the area is getting a lot more accessible. So we're talking to you in 2026, but who's to say in 2076? I don't know if whether they're still doing this podcast or not, but who's to know in future years how that's all going to work out. But the bottom line is, like Enamul said, it's caused a lot of friction within NATO and within the Western Alliance. You didn't hear much about Canada, but let me tell you something. Canada has heard a lot from the American president in the last week or two because of the speech our prime minister made in Davos, talking about how we've had a rupture in the world. And when the world was talking about Greenland a few weeks ago, and there was even the threat of an invasion. Now, I don't know how you'd invade Greenland because 57,000 people there, and the Americans already have forces there that are based on treaties in 1951 and before. Keep in mind that when Denmark was overrun by the Germans in World War II, the Americans occupied Greenland. So they do have a history there, and it's not all new. But of course, President Trump is very dramatic when he talks about it. So, like I've had many friends from tropical areas before, and I think there's a fascination with the Arctic. There's a fascination for me too. Polar bears, muskox, all kinds of different wildlife you've never seen before, ice that is crazy thick like you could never believe. But this region will be increasingly probably a region where there'll be some geopolitical tensions going on in the future. And we saw one example of that, in the last few weeks when the United States did what they did, and Denmark responded like they did, and they were supported by their European allies as well as Canada. Keep in mind, from a Canadian perspective, we always have to be careful when we defend their interest against the Americans because we live above them, and that is a tenuous place to be, depending on what the issue is. But this Greenland issue and the Arctic issue in general will probably become even more of a thing as we go on. And I'll throw it over to you, Enamel, and you can add in what you might have to say about this.
Thank you. Now, I think when I look into this whole map, I see that Greenland is going to, particularly the Arctic Ocean, is going to open up a new window. And it's not a window of trade only, it's also a window of reducing influence of some of the existing routes. If you think carefully on the existing routes, there are certain checkpoints. One of the checkpoints is Singapore. And we know Singapore will lose its economic power because of the 4 months of Arctic trade route. So that's number one. If you look at Gibraltar, that's another checkpoint. So you see, and you look Suez Canal, that's another checkpoint. So if you look into the route of the whole route, you will see that the influence has been changing, and this is 4 months in a year. They cannot operate, obviously, as you mentioned, it's an icy place, but 4 months in a year, they are predicting they will be able to run. And I think a few weeks ago, the first test ship went from Shanghai to all the way to Germany. I think that's what they went. So what tells me that is actually coming up. Probably not today, but within the next 10 years, if the global warming pursues, this is going to happen. And it's going to open up another window, particularly towards North America, where Canada probably will be more powerful and maintain the Arctic route, particularly within the archipelago that you talked about it. Given these, I think I see that with the increasing influence of the Arctic Ocean in the economic sphere of the world, and with the decreasing interest of the current what you call checkpoints, which are all controlled by either British or the American in most cases, I see the pressure mounting on United States because they will not be able to control all the trade routes as they think about it. So they are worried about it. That I can see. I can also see that the resources, because as of today, the world has been happy with the current resources, so particularly oil energy resources within the North Sea and within the Middle East and Mexico and Venezuela. If you remember, the Venezuela is in trouble because of this. I'm pretty sure that will be also true for many other. Iran is in trouble. Whatever is the reason, one of the fundamental reason, it has a large amount of oil resources, and Greenland probably another one. In another 20 years, probably this will be a place where they can have these oil exploration. At the moment, it's very difficult. So given all these potentials, I can see the conflict that is happening around the world is also moving towards the north. And that is something going to be, the world is going to change. We all know, I think your prime minister has mentioned that it's not a transition, it's rather a rupture in the world economy. But my worry is somewhere else. When you look into the whole story, the Russian occupation of Ukraine, American occupation, or whatever way you say it, of Venezuela, and currently the American pressure on Iran and the pressure on Greenland, to me, they are all same. But the world is not looking all of them in the same way. And that actually bothers me because I think we are losing the what you call, in a way, we are losing sight of fairness because these are the issues that should have been looked into carefully. And today there is another small news in the Bangladeshi newspaper, which is the UN chief has mentioned that they are in trouble. By July, they will be without funding and they have to change their funding strategy. He requested all the countries to pay their dues. So I can see there is a bigger trouble coming in the world if, because of the conflicts, because of non-participation, there is a change in the global affairs. You can also feel that the Board of Peace that's built by the United States, at least Trump, for the Middle East is another one. I'm not sure whether it's a parallel to UN or it's a parallel to NATO, but these are some of the ruptures that I can see. And I think the world should be careful around all this changing taking place within such a short time, within 1 year of Trump coming into power. Phil.
Well, it certainly it certainly has been a rupture from a Canadian perspective, and our Prime Minister said that, and you documented several other things that are going on with regard to trust. Let me add one more thing about the Arctic and about Canada and Greenland is that like when you lived here, we had a southern border and we went across it all the time. We also had freshwater lakes almost everywhere. But keep in mind, Ontario, where you lived, on the province of Ontario, has a saltwater coast,
Yeah.
and that's called Hudson's Bay, which is in the Arctic, and that coast is on Manitoba as well. And in Manitoba, we have a port called Churchill, Manitoba, which the Canadian government is hoping to expand as global warming continues and to be able to use a lot more. There's a railroad that goes up to it, and there's thoughts of a lot more infrastructure going to Churchill because to take advantage of the shipping lanes into the Arctic and out into Europe a lot faster than we can do now by shipping it by rail to the East Coast. So there's a lot of elements, there's a lot of elements to this. It's not just Greenland. It affects a whole bunch of things. However, it did get into the spotlight over the last 2 weeks. It certainly caused a lot of angst in European capitals, certainly here as well. And at the end of the day, we probably really still don't know what's going to happen with regard to the American position there. But I'm sure that'll be another topic for East West on another day.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us. And here we end this month's episode of East West. Thank you.
Thank you.